Okay, do me a favor. Close your eyes for a second. I want you to conjure up the version of France that lives in your head. You know the one. Maybe you're strolling along the Seine at twilight, the water catching the reflection of the golden stone on the Ile Saint-Louis. Maybe you're posted up at a tiny bistro table in the Marais, nursing a 14-euro glass of Pinot, surrounded by people who look effortlessly chic, people who seem completely unbothered by the grinding rat race that defines life in New York, London, or Tokyo. You look around, you take a sip, and you think, this is it. This is the peak of civilization. They figured it out. To the outsider, France looks like a miracle. It looks like a wealthy superpower that cracked the code of existence, how to balance modernity with tradition, and capitalism with actually enjoying your life. You see the Hermès scarves, the high-speed TGV trains, the massive nuclear power plants, and you assume the country's bank account matches the scenery. But I have to tell you, you are looking at a mirage. If you peel back that glossy layer of luxury marketing and tourism brochures, you find a nation that is structurally failing. You are stepping into a country that is undergoing a slow-motion collapse, disguised by the inertia of its own glorious past. It is a country where the social ladder has snapped, where the middle class is being chemically dissolved by inflation and taxation, and where the state is sitting on a fiscal fault line that makes the 2011 Greek crisis look like a warm-up act. The baguettes? Still world-class. The cheese? Unrivaled. But the math? The math is absolutely terrifying. Welcome to the paradox of the Fifth Republic. Over the next 40 minutes, we aren't just going to look at charts. We are going to dismantle the myth of French prosperity. We're going to dig into the 7 structural fractures that are turning the world's most visited country into the world's most beautiful open-air museum. And listen, this isn't just about bashing France. It's a case study on what happens when a wealthy democracy decides to ignore basic economics for half a century. Grab a drink. Let's look at the first fracture. Let's play a game. We're going to run a simulation. Imagine you are 24 years old. You're French. You're smart, ambitious, and you did everything right. You spent 2 brutal years in the classe préparatoire, which is basically the academic Hunger Games of the French elite. You scraped by, got into a decent business school, and graduated with a master's degree in marketing or logistics. You land your first real job in a solid regional city like Nantes or Toulouse. You are pumped. You are ready to start your life. Then, you open your first payslip. You look at the bottom line. 1,398 euros net. You blink. You wipe your glasses. Is there a typo? No, that is the reality. Now, look at your cousin. He didn't go to university. He hated school. He barely finished high school. He works as a shelf stocker at Carrefour or flips burgers at a fast food chain. He is earning the SMIC, the Salaire Minimum Interprofessionnel de Croissance. As of the latest indexation, his net take-home pay is roughly 1,398 euros. Do you see the horror here? The difference between the unskilled floor and the educated median has basically vanished. Economists have a fancy word for this phenomenon: Smicardization. It sounds like a disease, and honestly, it kind of is. It's the systemic flattening of the wage hierarchy. In the United States or Switzerland, The gap between a minimum wage worker and a median professional is a chasm. That gap is supposed to be the reward for your skills, your education, and your stress. In France, that gap has become a rounding error. Here is the data, and it's wild. In the 1990s, only about 8% of French workers were on minimum wage. It was a safety net for the very bottom. Today, that number has exploded to over 17.3%. And crucially, millions more are stuck just 50 euros or 100 euros above it. Why is this happening? It's a mechanical vice grip. Successive governments, terrified of poverty headlines, have aggressively indexed the minimum wage to inflation. That sounds noble, right? But here's the catch. They did not index the rest of the wage scale. At the same time, the cost of labor for companies is so astronomically high that employers simply cannot afford to maintain the gap. They cannot give the manager a raise when the floor rises. So the floor eventually just eats the manager. The result is a society where effort is totally decoupled from reward. Ask yourself, why should you take on the stress of management? Why stay late to finish a project? Why spend 5 years in university if the financial outcome is virtually identical to the guy who didn't? It turns the national economy into a massive participation trophy. Everyone gets a prize, but the prize is barely enough to survive. And let's talk about survival. There is a persistent myth that you don't need high wages in France because life is cheap and healthcare is free. Let me introduce you to the nightmare that is the French property market. If you want to rent a 25 square meter studio in Paris, and I'm not talking a penthouse, I'm talking a shoebox where you can touch the shower from the kitchen, you are looking at 900 euros to 1,200 euros a month. On a median salary, after paying for your phone, electricity, and food, you are mathematically insolvent. You aren't living in the city of lights. You are barely surviving in its shadows. The middle class isn't just shrinking, it is being compressed into the working poor. If you leave the glittering lights of the Champs-Élysées and drive 3 hours northeast, you enter the Grand Est, or the Hauts-de-France. This is the French Rust Belt. This is where the ghosts of the 20th century live. We all have this perception of France as an engineering titan. We think of the TGV breaking speed records. We think of the sleek Rafale fighter jets, or the massive nuclear reactors of EDF. And yes, those things exist, but they are the legacy of the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years post-World War II. They are the remnants of a previous civilization, like Roman aqueducts standing in a field. The harsh reality of the present is that France has effectively stopped making things. Let's look at the scoreboard. Manufacturing as a percentage of GDP in France has collapsed to under 10%. Compare that to the neighbors. Germany is hovering near 18 to 20%. Italy is around 15%. Even Switzerland, a country with some of the highest wages on earth, manufactures more per capita than France. France has deindustrialized more severely than the UK, a country usually mocked for having no industry left. How did this happen? It wasn't an accident. It was an arrogant strategic error. In the early 2000s, French policymakers and corporate titans fell in love with a concept called the fabless company. Serge Chiruk, the former CEO of Alcatel, famously declared that the future was a company without factories. The idea was that France would handle the brain work, the design, the branding, the marketing, and the dirty work of making the actual product would be outsourced to China or Eastern Europe. They wanted to turn France into a nation of consultants and luxury brand managers. They bet the house on tourism and services. They won the bet on tourism. France is the #1 destination in the world. But here is the problem. You cannot build a G7 superpower on the backs of waiters, tour guides, and Uber drivers. These are low-productivity, low-wage jobs. The consequences of this fabless fantasy were exposed brutally during the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020, the nation of Louis Pasteur, the nation that invented modern virology, discovered it did not have the domestic industrial capacity to manufacture basic paracetamol. The government had to scramble to fly in masks and painkillers from Asia. It was a national humiliation. But the economic cost is even worse than the humiliation. When you close a factory in a small town like Amiens or Saint-Étienne, you don't just lose the factory, you lose the ecosystem. The logistics company closes, the local bakery loses its customers, the tax base evaporates, the doctor retires and nobody replaces him because the town is dying. This is the engine of political radicalization. When you see footage of the Gilets jaunes setting fire to toll booths, do not mistake it for simple hooliganism. This is the scream of peripheral France. These are people living in the industrial wastelands, where the only economic life left is a warehouse and a supermarket, watching Paris celebrate record sales of €4,000 handbags. While LVMH conquers the world, the actual French economy is fighting over crumbs. Let's talk about the national credit card. You often hear about the U.S. national debt, but the United States has a massive, it owns the printing press of the world's reserve currency. If push comes to shove, the Fed can print its way out of a jam. France does not have that luxury. France uses the euro. It effectively borrows in a foreign currency managed by a bank in Frankfurt that is culturally allergic to inflation. As of 2024, France's public debt has smashed through the 112% of GDP barrier. To put that in context, the European Union's founding treaty, the Maastricht Treaty, has a golden rule. Debt should not exceed 60%. France waved goodbye to 60% 20 years ago and never looked back. Here is a statistic that should keep you awake at night. The French government has not passed a balanced budget since 1974. Think about that. For 50 years, half a century, France has spent more than it earned, every single year. It doesn't matter if the president was a socialist, a conservative, or a centrist. The addiction to deficit spending is the only truly bipartisan consensus in French politics. Where is the money going? If this debt were funding massive infrastructure projects, new nuclear plants, or a futuristic military, you could argue it's an investment. It's not. France's infrastructure is aging. The military is critically under-equipped for a high-intensity war. The money is being incinerated in social operating costs. France spends between 32% and 34% of its GDP on social welfare. This is the world record. It is higher than the Scandinavian countries. It is a welfare state on steroids, financed by a credit card that is maxing out. We are now reaching the tipping point. In the 2024/2025 budgets, the cost of servicing the debt, just paying the interest, not paying down the principal, has exploded. It is on track to become the largest single budget item, surpassing the budget for national education. Think about the morality of that. The French state will soon spend more money paying off the interest on past mistakes than it spends educating its own children. The bond markets are noticing. The spread between French and German borrowing costs is widening. This is the financial world's way of saying, we don't trust you as much as we used to. If that trust breaks, The austerity required to fix it will make the current unrest look like a picture. If France is the world champion of anything, beating Brazil in football or the US in soft power, it is undoubtedly taxation. Let's go back to that HR office. Let's look at the anatomy of a salary. This is where the American mind usually breaks, so if you're from the US, maybe sit down for this part. Let's say a French company wants to hire a mid-level manager. They budget 60,000 euros a year for this role. That is the super brut, total employer cost. Step 1. The government takes a massive bite immediately. These are the employer contributions. Poof. Roughly 15,000 euros to 17,000 euros vanishes into thin air. Step 2. We are now at the gross salary, the number written on the contract. Roughly 43,000 euros. But the employee doesn't get this, not even close. Step 3. The government takes a second bite. These are the employee contributions for retirement, health, unemployment, CSG, CRDS. Another 10,000 euros vanishes. Step 4. We arrive at the net salary, roughly 33,000 euros. Step 5. But wait, we aren't done. Now you have to pay income tax on that net amount. And then, everything you buy carries a 20% VAT. By the time the money actually reaches the cash register at the grocery store, the state has confiscated nearly 55% to 60% of the value created by your labor. France consistently ranks as having the highest tax burden in the OECD. The state captures nearly half of the entire annual wealth production of the nation. This creates a vicious, stagnant cycle. Companies can't pay high net wages because the tax wedge is too thick. Employees have low disposable income, so they consume less. The domestic market stagnates. The government sees the stagnation, panics, and says, "We need more money to fix this," and raises taxes or closes loopholes. It is an economic boa constrictor. It squeezes slowly. You don't realize you are suffocating until you try to save for a down payment or invest in a business, and you realize the capital just isn't there. And God forbid you try to be successful. France has a cultural and fiscal allergy to wealth accumulation. For years, the ISF, Solidarity Tax on Wealth, taxed people simply for owning assets regardless of income. It was effectively a rent on existence. While Macron watered it down to focus on real estate, the psychological message remains. Success is suspicious. Please apologize for it by giving us half. Do you remember the images from 2023? Paris burning, garbage piled 10 feet high on the sidewalks, riot police charging through tear gas clouds. Was this a revolution? Was it a coup? No. The government had proposed raising the retirement age from 62 to 64. To the rest of the world, this looked like insanity. In Germany, the retirement age is drifting toward 67. In the US, it's similar. But in France, asking people to work 2 more years was treated as a violation of the Geneva Conventions. But here is the dark reality that the protesters refused to acknowledge. The French pension system is a Ponzi scheme running out of new investors. It is a pay-as-you-go system. There is no vault where your money is saved. The euros deducted from your paycheck today are wired instantly to a retiree's account today. You are directly funding your grandmother's vacation in Nice right now. This system works beautifully when demographics are young. In 1960, there were 4 workers for every 1 retiree. The burden was light. Today, there are roughly 1.7 workers for every one retiree. By 2040, it will be closer to 1.3. France is aging rapidly. The baby boomers are retiring en masse, living longer, which is good, but requiring expensive pensions and healthcare for 25+ years. Meanwhile, the workforce, the people paying the bill, is shrinking relative to the retired population. The math is brutal. The system is bleeding billions. The government has two choices, both terrible. Cut pensions. This is political suicide. The elderly vote. Raise taxes on workers. But we just established that taxes are already at a breaking point. So they tried the third option. Make people work longer. And the country exploded. This reveals a state of national paralysis. The young generation knows, deep down, that they will never receive the pension they are paying for. They are being taxed to death to support a generation that is wealthier, owns the real estate, and retires earlier than they ever will. It is an intergenerational robbery. And it is making the active, working population poorer with every passing year. Walk into a quantitative finance floor at Goldman Sachs in New York. Walk into a DeepMind AI lab in London. Walk into a biotech startup in Kendall Square, Boston. Look at the badges. Listen to the accents. You will be shocked by how many French names you find. France produces legitimate geniuses. The education system, specifically the Grande École, like Polytechnique or Centrale, is a machine for producing world-class mathematicians, engineers, and coders. But France cannot keep them. This is the great brain drain. It is the hemorrhaging of the nation's most valuable resource, human capital. Put yourself in the shoes of a top-tier AI researcher or a quant trader. Option A, France. Stay in Paris. Earn 50,000 euros. Pay 50% marginal tax. Struggle to find an apartment. Deal with a rigid corporate hierarchy where promotion is based on seniority, not merit. Option B, USA/Switzerland. Move to San Francisco or Geneva. Earn $200,000 plus. Pay lower taxes. Live in comfort. Be given responsibility immediately. It is not a difficult choice. It's barely a choice at all. Estimates suggest that nearly 2.5 to 3 million French citizens live abroad. But this isn't a random sampling of the population. These are the risk takers, the entrepreneurs, the scientists. When the smartest people leave, the innovation leaves with them. Why is there no French Google? Why is there no French Amazon? Look at the founders of modern tech giants. Many are French. They just didn't build their companies in France. They built Snowflake in Silicon Valley. They built Moderna, the CEO is French, in Boston. The French taxpayer subsidizes the incredibly expensive education of these elites, and then the American or British economy reaps the dividends of their productivity. It creates a country that feels stagnant, a country where ambition is capped. If you stay, you accept the ceiling. If you want to break through, you buy a plane ticket. But wait, I hear you argue. At least the services are amazing. At least the trains run on time and the schools are elite. This is the final and perhaps saddest nail in the coffin. The free stuff is breaking. For decades, the social contract was, we take half your money in taxes, but in exchange, we give you the best public services on earth. That contract is now null and void. Go to a French emergency room today. You are looking at wait times of 10, 15, sometimes 24 hours. There are entire regions of rural France called déserts médicaux, where you physically cannot find a general practitioner to treat you. The doctors are retiring, and the quota system kept the supply artificially low for decades. Look at the education system. Historically, the French school system was the envy of the world. In the latest PISA rankings, France has slid to the mediocre middle of the pack. But worse, it is now one of the most unequal systems in the OECD. The gap between elite Parisian schools and the rest is widening. Teachers are underpaid and demoralized, leading to a crisis where the ministry is hiring unqualified staff via speed dating events just to put a warm body in front of the chalkboard. Look at the justice system. It is notoriously underfunded, with cases dragging on for years. The tragedy is that the French people are still paying luxury hotel prices in taxes, but they are increasingly receiving budget motel service. When the public sector fails, those with money opt out. They send their kids to private schools, which are booming. They go to private clinics. They pay for private security. This creates a two-tier society. The wealthy insulate themselves from the decline, while the middle class and the poor are left with the crumbling ruins of the welfare state. The word égalité, chiseled onto the town halls, is starting to look less like a promise and more like a cruel joke. If economics is the hardware of a country, psychology is the software, and France's software has a massive virus. You might think the most pessimistic people on Earth live in war zones or extreme poverty. You would be wrong. Year after year, global polling shows that the French are the world champions of pessimism, often ranking lower than citizens of Iraq or Afghanistan when asked about their future. Why? Why is a country with 5 weeks of paid vacation, the best wine, and a temperate climate so miserable? It comes down to the gap between expectation and reality. The French are raised on the myth of La Grande Nation. They grow up hearing about Louis XIV, Napoleon, de Gaulle, the Enlightenment, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They are told they are the center of the civilized world. But when they look out the window, they see a country that is shrinking in influence. They see their language being replaced by globish in boardrooms. They see their culture being Netflixized. It creates a collective cognitive dissonance. It is like a fading aristocrat who still lives in the ancestral castle, but can't afford to fix the leaking roof or heat the ballroom. They wear the velvet robes, but they are shivering. This pessimism is a hidden tax on the economy. Consumers save rather than spend because they fear the future. Entrepreneurs don't start businesses because fear of failure is paralyzed. In France, bankruptcy is a social scarlet letter, whereas in the US, it's a badge of experience. Voters turn to radicals because they feel the system is rigged. You can change a tax law in a week. You cannot change a national mood in a decade. This psychological weight is dragging the recovery down. Now, before you sit back in your chair in Chicago, London, or Toronto and laugh at the French, let me give you a serious warning. France is not an anomaly. It is a time machine. France is showing you exactly what happens when a wealthy Western democracy runs out of road. It is the test case for a specific type of economic sclerosis that is coming for everyone else. Look at the symptoms. Aging population. France hit the wall first, but the US is only 10 years behind. Deindustrialization. France gutted its factories faster, but the American Rust Belt tells the same story. Debt addiction. France's 112% is bad, but the US is racing to catch up, running trillion-dollar deficits in peacetime. Political polarization. The collapse of the centrist parties and the rise of the extremes is a preview of the polarization tearing apart the UK and US. France is the laboratory. It is trying to maintain a 20th century standard of living with 21st century demographics and 19th century industrial thinking. If France breaks, if the bond vigilantes finally attack French debt, if the EU has to bail out the second largest economy on the continent, it won't just be a French problem. It will be a global financial cataclysm. It will be 2008, but with better wine and angrier rioters. So, is France doomed? Not necessarily. This is a country that survived the 100 Years' War, the Revolution, 2 world wars, and occupation. There is a resilience in the French character, a stubbornness that should never be underestimated. There are signs of life. The tech scene in Paris is growing. There is a generation of young people tired of the old dogmas who want to build. But the math is relentless. The debt is real. The aging is real. The poverty of the middle class is real. France is living on borrowed time and borrowed money. The illusion of wealth is maintained by debt, and social peace is purchased with money the state doesn't have. The question isn't if a correction is coming. The question is when. And for you, the lesson is simple. Don't let the postcard fool you. Don't let the luxury brands distract you. And most importantly, look at your own country's balance sheet, because the French disease is contagious, and you might already be infected. If you want to understand who might fall next, you need to watch our upcoming breakdown on why Germany is dying quietly. It makes the French situation look like a picnic. And if I shattered your Emily in Paris fantasy just a little bit today, hit that like button. It helps the algorithm more than a government subsidy. See you in the next one.